Hello and welcome to our third class on the book of Exodus, going over Walter Brueggemann's book, Delivered Out of Empire, Pivotal Moments in the Book of Exodus, Part 1. Today, we will be going over Chapter 2 of that book, which covers Chapters 3 and 4 of Exodus, with a special focus on Chapter 3, verse 14. And he has entitled this chapter, The God with the Hidden Name. As we said last week, this is a book that focuses on pivotal moments in the book of Exodus, and Brueggemann identifies Exodus 3:14 as the pivotal moment he wants to discuss in chapter 2 of his book. And it reads, God said to Moses, I am who I am. He said further, thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. This verse comes right after Moses has asked God, who shall I say sent me? And I'd like to take a moment for us to pause and consider how we would feel if somebody responded with these words. If you asked them, what is your name? And they said, I am who I am. I think Popeye says that, maybe the cartoon character Popeye says that. It's not really an answer if you think about it, except to say, here I am what I do, I am what you see, I am what I say, and I'm not going to be more descriptive than that. And when it comes to naming God, this question of what does this mean becomes the entire point. Who is this God who simply says, I am? God is who God is, in other words, and we can better understand this God by noticing what this God does. In Exodus chapters 3 and 4, which were the chapters to be read in preparation for this discussion, Moses encounters God in a burning bush. Classic story. A conversation ensues. God tells Moses that the cries of the Israelites in Egypt have been heard. We heard a bit about that last week, repeated again in chapter 3, and that Moses is to be sent back to Egypt, where he's a wanted man, to confront the Pharaoh and bring the people out of Egypt. That's a summary of verse 10. I've taken a screenshot of page 8, or part of page 8 of the book, and it reads, given that risky mandate of issuing an imperative demand to Pharaoh, it is no wonder that Moses resists the divine assignment. In a lot of chapters 3 and 4, the majority of chapters 3 and 4, is Moses objecting to this. And Moses offers 5 objections to the mandate and receives 5 prompt refutations from Yahweh. First response of Moses is, who am I that you should send me? And God's response is, I will be with you. To paraphrase, it's not about you. I will be with you. You are just to respond. Who you are isn't as important as I am going with you. The second question that Moses has is, who shall I say sent me? And I am sent you is the response. And that will be the majority of today's discussion. But then there are 3 more objections that Moses makes. What if they don't believe me? And to which God answers, here are some divine signs that you can display. Turning his staff into a snake, and then also putting his hand into his coat and pulling it out, it being leprous, and then putting it back in his cloak to heal it. Then Moses goes on to say, I have never been eloquent. Some even have speculated that perhaps Moses had a stutter, to which God answers, I will be your mouth. I will give you the words to say. And at this point, you have to wonder if Moses isn't simply throwing something to the wall to see if it'll stick. He really does not want to go, which is exemplified in the last response, which really isn't an excuse, but more of an ask or a plea. Send someone else, please. Just send someone else. To which God says, your brother Aaron will go with you and speak for you. In each of Moses's case, in each case, writes Brueggemann, Moses's objection is overruled by the uncompromising divine resolve. God is not going to let Moses off the hook because God's purposes, which is freeing the Israelites, are so stalwart and fixed. God is singularly focused on the salvation of the Israelites. But in this chapter, as you'll know if you've read it, Brueggemann wants to focus on Moses' second question and the naming of God. Who shall I say sent me? Tell them I am has sent you. Perhaps we can learn something about this God and the naming. However, I got to say from the onset, God's answer has led to both questions and answers, then more questions, and then more guesses. Brueggemann writes, the response made to Moses' question is obscure and enigmatic. It is not the direct response Moses wanted. For good reason, interpreters have struggled to find adequate explanation for the divine answer that is readily but enigmatically rendered, I am who I am. The verb of I am is some form of to be. So if you just take the I am by itself, to be. It may possibly be a causative verb, thus, I cause to be. So maybe God is saying, I cause to be. I am the one who causes. Perhaps the name implies that the God who sends Moses is the creator, progenitor, and the source of all that is. Here is a God, if this is the best interpretation, here is a God who brings about what was not there before. All of it, nature, the heavens, heavenly hosts, and realms. So this God would have the power to call new things into being going forward. The I am has created and will continue to create new things. The implication being that there may be a new creation, a new future for the Israelites, new possibilities on the other side of their enslavement that they could not conceptualize, but the God who has created can pull it off. The Hebrew used here for God's name is obscure and on purpose. Taking the meaning alone, I am, may not even be about God's causing all that is. And so I don't want to say necessarily forget all that I just said. That's one possibility, but it's by no means certain. It can mean that, but does not have to mean that alone, or indeed at all, which leads to other possibilities. Brueggemann writes, if, however, the causative verb is not granted here, in other words, if that's not what this means, that God is the cause of everything, although we do believe God is the cause of everything, but if that's not what is meant here in this name, then we are left with a straightforward indicative, I shall be present, or I am really there. The assertion of divine presence that is certain and durable suggests two assurances. One is that Israel, in its risky departure from Pharaoh, can count on the accompaniment of Yahweh as protector and guide. The importance of such an accompaniment is acknowledged by Moses in his later insistence, if your presence will not go, do not carry us from here. The second assurance implied by this name, I shall be present, is that God will outlast Pharaoh, will indeed outlast all despots, in fact. The pharaohs of the world may seem ever present, but their time does come to an end. Not so with God. The God whose name is I am outlasts all of these, is always really there, is always present, and will always be present. So this is another possible meaning packed into this name, I am, or I am what I will be, or I shall be what I shall be, depending on how it's rendered in English. And all of the various ways it's rendered in different languages alludes again to the obscurity of the language itself. It is hard to know how to translate this Hebrew phrase, which is unique. All this to say, one thing is certain to Moses, the God who has called him to that burning bush is doing a new thing. That much is made clear to Moses. But the God who is doing these new things gives Moses a name that once brings about deep theological reflection, as we've been experiencing in these past minutes. But again, it also obscures. To that, Brueggemann writes, it is to be noticed that the divine self-announcement guarantees the hiddenness of God. In the very utterance of self-revealing, the divine agent is in fact concealed. As Moses later on will not be permitted to see the divine face, chapter 33, verse 20, so here Moses is not given access to the divine name. Thus, Martin Buber, another biblical scholar, can say, it is impossible to conjure me. The qualitative distance between Yahweh and Moses, or Israel, is maintained. God is indeed other, wholly other, and Yahweh's entry into the slave camp surrenders none of that. And why is this important? Well, it was believed that evoking the name of a deity gave one certain control over that deity's powers. To know the name of a deity was to be able to evoke the name so that it might do things for you. Praying or summoning in a deity's name might affect that deity's agenda or action in the world. But the God who spoke to Moses in the burning bush would not give Moses a name like this, and thus could not be used like this. Here is a God who remains inscrutable and beyond our comprehension. At the same time, this God is close as that burning bush, and inviting us to trust in God's divine actions in the world, namely actions that lead to life from dead places. Brueggemann writes, the exchange between the God who dispatches and the historical agent dispatched did not result in self-confidence or self-assurance. In other words, my paraphrase, it did not give the Israelites the ability to confidently evoke the name of the deity, the exact name of the deity, the parameters of the God drawn around that God in language, but rather it didn't give them that. Instead, it led to worship. Again, quoting Brueggemann, an act that constituted the transfer of loyalty from the system of Pharaoh to the alternative that Yahweh would enact through presence or through historical agency. What is to come will be a historical novum, or new thing, that is inexplicable in Pharaoh's enslaving categories. That novum, moreover, will be enacted by the divine agent in a way that fits none of the categories of either Pharaoh or the slaves. In response to the resistance of Moses, it is insisted that the God who will save will not conform to any pre-existing expectation or category. The new disclosure of God will be matched only by the new trust of Israel, a trust that is ready to depart the settled, unbearable world of Pharaoh. All this to say, end quote. My words, all this to say, we will never have adequate words, names for God. I am who I am is as best as we can hope for when it comes to giving an exact name to God. These words allude to the mystery of God. If this is all we had to go on, I'm not sure that this would be very much help. And while it is good for us to understand that God is outside of our understanding, this gives us little else to go on, which is why the second identifier given Moses is exceedingly important. God identified God's self in two ways. One is with this I am who I am, which is much as say is I'm beyond your understanding, but also seen in my presence in your story, in the story of your ancestors, in the story of your present moment, and in the story as it unrolls in the future. So you can come to know God by God's actions in the world, in other words, which leads us to the second identifier that God gives, which is all about God's actions in the world. God reveals God's self to Moses as I am, but also in the following way. Verse 15 of chapter 3. Thus you shall say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my title for all generations. And God identifies in this way 4 times in Exodus chapters 2 and 3. In 2:24 and in 3:16, the formula is simply the God of once, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But then in verses 3:6 and 3:15, it reads the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So God is repeated with each ancestor, which is meant to emphasize this point. It's being written down in a way to really hammer this point home, that the God's name is in part the way God has been in the past. So you want to know the name of God. You can't put a word to it, but you can look at God's actions in the past with your ancestors and learn something about this God. And so the second identifier, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, becomes something we can sink our teeth into and come to some understanding about the nature of this God who really cannot be named. While giving God a proper name may well be impossible, identifying God by way of God's actions in the past may give us some traction, as I was just saying. By God telling Moses that the same God who had led his ancestors through adversity was also with him and the Israelites still, while they are enslaved, Moses can come to know better the God who is calling him. The Israelites will discover by way of this knowledge that their God is a God that liberates the oppressed, just as God had been there with their ancestors in the past and had led them through amazing things and tough things and terrible things to glorious things. That same God is with them in the present moment. And Pharaoh will learn this too, but from the opposite direction. The lowly Israelites will come to a better understanding of their worth. Conversely, Pharaoh, the alleged God king, is humbled and repositioned in the narrative and in the arc of history. Israel and Pharaoh both come to know God, but from very different perspectives. Or as Brueggemann puts it, both parties now know. Partly this new knowledge is cognitive awareness based on what has been performed before their very eyes, but the verb know does not simply concern the transmission of data. More important, the term is relational, a relational political one that has to do with recognition, acknowledgement, and finally allegiance. Thus, the narrative to follow this divine self-declaration in 3:14 is in order that Israel may come to trust and obey Yahweh. Such a commitment requires disengagement from all loyalty to Pharaoh, the very one whom they had taken to be an absolute beyond challenge. The narrative process is the slow relinquishment of that loyalty that had until now been unquestioned. In like manner, the quote-unquote education of Pharaoh, which Pharaoh, of course, resisted, concerns coming to an awareness that Yahweh's authority is beyond challenge. Pharaoh's governance is rendered at best as penultimate and at worst as illegitimate. The learning of both parties is slow, different from each other, and contested, because it entails the relinquishment of an entire world of assumptions about order, legitimacy, and control. By the end of the narrative, however, it will be clear to both Israel and to Pharaoh that a radical newness has entered their history and has deconstructed old realities. In the wake of that declaration, one party weeps in abject sadness, and the other dances in unrestrained exuberance. That's a quote from page 13. Now I would like to bring us back for questions for discussion. I'm going to ask that you all unmute yourselves. I'll pull up the discussion question, which is, what is God communicating to Moses and to the people of God by saying, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob? What does this connection to the ancestors of Genesis suggest about God who acts in response to the cry of Israel?
That he's been with them a long time and continues to be with them.
To me, it says that in the Jewish history, as I think of it, or as I believe it to be, we don't have grandson or great-grandson or anything like that. Abraham was Jacob's father as well as Isaac's father. And so he's saying that he continues to be the father of the family. It's not generational division. It's just one continually big family.
Am I jumping in too soon, Sue? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, because I can't see anything. But I think it's calling to their memory, of surely they have some kind of memory of, the ancestors. Maybe they've lost it. I don't know. I mean, the pharaohs forgot Joseph, but maybe they have some vestigial memory of their ancestors, and maybe it revives the sense of their where they came from, and their connection to Yahweh if they can hear those names again, and the promises that Yahweh made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
But when they leave Egypt, they take Jacob's bones with them. So yes, they have the history, and they know that they're.
I thought he was already buried. I thought he was already buried before that. I thought that Joseph took his father's.
Not Jacob. Isaac.
Isaac
was returned.
Oh.
But Jacob, when he died, said, "When you go, take my bones with you." I think, right? Correct me if I'm wrong.
I believe that that's correct.
I thought I thought Jacob had long died before, but
Let me look it up.
okay.
Let's
Anyway,
think.
Do we have any idea of how many generations it's been since Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac up to this point?
400 years.
How much?
400 years.
400?
So what? If 100 years is a generation, which is long, but they
Generally, yeah.
yeah, that would be what? 40? No. Yeah, 40.
Well,
Long.
in my thinking, maybe they had just kind of forgotten and had, steered away from God during this time, particularly when they're, they're going through the famine and all these other terrible things that have happened to them. They're probably thinking, where is God?
I don't think they've forgotten.
Well, I'm reading
But
that.
I don't think they expect it. I think after 400 years of being in Egypt, that is their life, and that's what they know. They don't, there's no one around to tell them what they left behind. And so this is all that they know.
and they were protected by Pharaoh. I mean, the lineage. They were
Yeah,
somewhat protected.
I'm reading that.
When the author said, if I understood it right, that there was conflict between them and Pharaoh. And I'm thinking, they're getting food. I mean, how many times in the desert do they say, well, at least we had fish and vegetables in Egypt? They were existing. Was their existence pleasant? Maybe not. They probably were beaten when they were building their pyramids or whatever. But
slavery is
but
never
it was an
an
existence.
acceptable route.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I don't think they were very happy.
No.
Well, it says that
No.
the cries of the people was what brought God into this story.
Mhm.
But also to your question earlier, Jacob was buried in the family plot. Joseph was the one whose bones was carried out of it. So either way,
Joseph.
it does tie them in with their ancestors, Joseph, son of-
Joseph. Okay, Joseph was good. Thank you.
But this, if you recall our discussions about when the Torah was compiled in its final form, as we are experiencing the story, the first people to have read this would have been as part of the exile under Babylon. And so either way you cut it, whoever's reading this at any time, this hearkening back to and a reminder to what God had done for the people. For the Israelites in Egypt, it was, for their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. For those reading the Exodus narrative for the first time, it would be a remembering of this liberation that we know is coming. That the text where we are now in the text is, Moses hasn't quite seen his way through yet to that. But the most important idea is if you're looking for the name of God, I am who I am is not very satisfactory until you look at who God has been. And when you look at who God has been, it gives you some ideas about God's values. And as Christians, we believe that we see in Jesus a new and clear representation of who God is when combined with humanity as another, for instance. And so the ministry of Jesus becomes this for us. But you don't need to be a Christian to see other acts of God in the world calling humanity towards redemption and restoration. And and so is that a name of God? Not exactly, but it describes God. And I think the distinction between I am who I am and remembering who God has been is to emphasize the point that you can't really put words to it. And once you put words to it, you create an idol. For instance, in this story, Pharaoh is an idol.
Yeah.
Manifest as God king, believing himself to be deity. All of the pharaohs had very distinct names, and invoking the name of the pharaoh, you evoke that person's authority and power and might, but defined so narrowly in this despot, this tyrant. And that will happen. Paul Tillich says anytime you give name or symbol to describe God, you've created an idol. Now it's the best you can do with human language, but you must always be aware of that tendency. And
I think when we try to think about words that describe God, like love and provider and healer and all-knowing, all-powerful, they're all our words. And God is not human body. You know, all we can do is use the words we know, but in reality, you know, he's way beyond
Right.
our words.
It's still the best we can do. I mean,
Yeah, that is the best we can do. Exactly.
Right, with words. Yeah. Yeah. And without words, we can do that. We can do more.
yeah, when you know something you can't articulate is a kind of knowing, but when words fail us, you're like on the edges of something beyond language. And that's what makes that's where religious folk get themselves into a bind, is when they think they've got it. I refer to God on paper, got God down on paper. And and there are many who insist that this is the case, that they have cornered the market on descriptions of God. And I'm glad one of our Christian virtues that's emphasized again and again is humility.
There's a story from long ago, I heard long ago, about this person that understood all about God. And he took all this knowledge that he had and he put it in a shoebox and he put it up on the shelf because he knew all about God. Then when he took the shoebox down, it was empty. His idea of God was gone.
My concept of perceiving whatever God is like an ant trying to perceive what this human towering over him or her is. I would say it's close to the same ratio. Our ratio to God may be even further. Who knows?
And I think the one piece of hope is that, you know, we have that spark of God's consciousness in us. And so with that consciousness, we can ultimately know God's consciousness or know. And so I think whatever pitiful words we try to use to describe God, you know, in these waking moments, we can acquire some other tools of consciousness to expand and explore, you know, those other ways of knowing God. So I think Moses had one of those experiences with the burning bush, and I mean, it's the telling of the tale is pretty remarkable. You know, take off your shoes and you're on holy ground. I'm sure can you imagine what that would have been like for somebody to see this burning bush that's not consumed? And,
entirely disorienting. All of the categories.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, right. Totally. Reality just completely dissolved. And he's arguing with him. No, I'm not going to do that. I can't do that. Yeah, I can. Yeah, I mean, it would have been just totally out of the ordinary. And oh, I'm just Moses. What am I going to do? So.
And I think a lot of the times when we think about God being visible, quote, quote, can't be, but, you know, visible in the Bible, he's a light, he's a cloud, or as he went past the rock, he was silent, right? Is that right? He was silent. So, and yet we don't think of God at all as being silent. We think of powerful and almighty, and so everything.
Clear terms we think we understand.
Yeah.
You're
And
right.
when you think about his throne room, when you think about the rainbow and the sea of glass and all the jewels and things glittering from his glory, from the power that he's giving off, that how can our feeble minds envision what he is?
That's why it's a mystical experience
Yeah,
to even
Right.
approach.
right.
This folds straight into our next question. We've basically been talking about question number 2, which I'll paraphrase. As the author invites us to think about God's name, I am who I am, as signifying the durable presence and that accompanies, sustains Israel, surpasses Pharaoh, and overturns all other authority by asserting something new. It talks about how this God is beyond our categories, but always hidden. Then it goes on to say, what about the reality of God, of the God who is with us yet beyond us, requires an act of faith and worship, a transfer of loyalty from the system of Pharaoh to the alternative reality of God. Does this God evoke your trust and obedience? And here's where I'm at with this question is I'm picturing this God who we wished we could have in very clear terms, but now I'm beginning to realize that it's a bit like leaping off into not even the ocean, but into what? This mystery that you just can't unpack with words. There's a song by a band that I like. The band's called Husband and Wife, and the song has a chorus. It goes, as a child, I swam. It's talking about theology. As a child, I swam. As an adult, I floated under the surface, afraid I'll understand. Wait, as an adult, I swam. As an adult, I floated on the surface, afraid I'll understand what goes on in the deep. I'm nervous. Going down into as a child, you think it's just all, these are the stories. I could picture God in my mind's eyes, this little man with a beard, and then a big man with, and then you get older, and I'm much more cautious when trying to give clear language. I'm glad we're part of a tradition that's very old that has given us some language to use. But anyway, this question, does this God evoke your trust and obedience?
Yes, because of what he did
There you go.
to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He was faithful to them, took care of them. He brought Israel out of slavery into the promised land, and they were the ones that ruined it. So yeah, God takes care of us.
I was entering that question by way of I am who I am. What is that? And then I forgot the second part, which is I am the God of your. Yeah. And that's where testimony from those who've gone before us, the testimonies of those who have gone before us is so important, because not all of us have lived into something like that reality. And I'm still going through life thinking that I've lived through some things like that, but still really leaning hard on the witness of those who have gone before me, who tell me that it's okay. As I'm experiencing the world as it is in my 30s, not sure if this is normal. The people who've been through different things telling me that it will be okay, whether they're ancient authors or mentors in my life. And in a way, they're saying, I've followed the God of your ancestors. I am your ancestor in a spiritual, mystical sense, and I can give a witness. So for me, it really
To
isn't
the
a fall.
club. I'm in my 80s. I'm still got the same questions.
Your answer, Sue, reminded me of the answer of my mentor, who is Ron Allen, who you've heard preach, where we were talking about the world and the world being free in the future, pretty wide open. And I said, can God pull this off? Will creation be restored and redeemed in humanity? And he goes, why, yes. And I was like, how can you know that? And he goes, because I believe God is sovereign, meaning over all and through all, and all that God can do to restore, God will do. And there's no proof there, but his testimony to that fact, as somebody who I trust implicitly, he had enough faith for the both of us in that moment, I think is what I'm saying.
Well, I think
and
when you
that-
think
with that, we
there are,
approach mysticism.
I think when you think there's I don't know how many prophecies about Jesus, I forget, 300 and some, I don't know. I don't remember. But every single one of those prophecies came true. And the Bible tells us what's going to happen in the future. And if those prophecies came true, then these prophecies are going to come true also. That's the way I look at it.
Well, good. This is I'm gonna move on through the questions without, I don't want to stifle any conversation, but I would like to get through these, especially to the last one. And I'm gonna blur the third and the fourth together because they have to do with one another. He writes, the unveiling of God who brings something new into being requires both the Israelites and Pharaoh to undergo an education, unlearning deeply held assumptions and categories that have structured their reality. And there's a quote from page 13 that I read earlier. I'll read it again. The learning of both parties is slow, different from each other, and contested because it entails the relinquishment of an entire world of assumptions about order, legitimacy, and control. When have you been forced to reckon with something dramatic and new and to relinquish old interpretations of reality? What did this reveal to you about God? But then I'd like to combine that with the next question, which is that the author notes that the total overhaul of reality provokes weeping in some and celebration in others. Why is this so? What do you think your response would be or has been in the past? So both of these questions point towards God's actions in the world educate Pharaoh and the Israelites in different ways. The Pharaoh learns that his alleged authority as God king doesn't hold sway in the end. And the Israelites come to a greater sense of their worth and the possibilities for their future. And so what was rejoicing and led to worship for the Israelites led to weeping and sorrow and trauma, probably, for Pharaoh. And so I'm not sure what question I want to focus on here. I guess, why is this so? And what do you think your response would be, or what has it been in the past? Is a bit self-serving. I think we'd all like to say, my response would be like the Israelites. It would be hard to name those things about ourselves that are Pharaoh-ish. We all have our blind spots. I don't know. What do these questions stir up in you? I'll just leave it at that.
Well, the
I don't know.
education
I guess-
part of it is going to be the experience. What have you experienced that made a positive impact in your faith structure? Is that vague enough?
Well, I'm thinking my mind went to the apartheid in South Africa and when it fell, and how the experience was very different for the 85% of Black indigenous peoples who lived there and the 15% of colonizers, of Afrikaners, and how it is still, I mean, I've seen documentaries made by white supremacists in the last 5 years that are meant to give voice to the angst and anger of the Afrikaners. And so what was clearly a joyful and welcome experience for 85%. And by the way, I am for the apartheid falling, and my heart is with the Black South Africans who were finally given political voice, even though there's still work to be done. I mean, it was a huge step forward, don't get me wrong, but that experience would have been felt viscerally different depending on which side you were. And so, in our own context, when Governor Wallace stands on the court steps in Alabama and says segregation then, now, and forever with conviction. You know, he is experiencing those times differently than those who are pining for their freedom. I think that's what these questions are about. And so for Pharaoh, this was terrible for him. I don't want to say that I feel sorry for him. That's not my point. But how you experience, here it is. In C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, he writes about how all in the end will see God's love for what it is. But some who have been filled with hate in life might experience that love as fire. And those that accept that love experience it as their very life. Again, using language and symbol, not to be exactly literal, but I do know I have experienced people being enraged at an act of charity or kindness because they've been so twisted by malice, you know. So liberation for the Israelites meant one thing to them. I don't know if I'm making things clear or making things less clear, but that's where my mind went with these questions.
I think sometimes reality changes gradually. And so therefore, what used to be normal is now abnormal. And I think that's where I have a problem with the question, is that I don't see things as abruptly, like with Africa. I mean, they made a big decision.
Okay, hang on.
So, you know, I just think about this country, how Sundays used to have blue laws and nobody did anything on Sunday, you know, and now it's a big shopping day.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we enjoy our coats on Sunday. I think we may not always react because of the change being so slow, so casual. It's just like, oh, this is normal now. But when you think about it, this normal now would be very abnormal. And so for me, this is a difficult question to and I think about Christians today in the United States. You know, they came here, they put a cross in the sand, and they said, we claim this country for God. And today we are just walking away from God. What is it? 30% of the people that used to attend church no longer attend church. So, you know, our nation's totally changed, but now this is our reality.
I think looking at the whole picture here with Pharaoh, I mean, God didn't just come in and zap Pharaoh and save the Israelites. I mean, we're not to it yet, but with all the plagues, you know, he just kept, Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And, you know, they went through 10 or 12 plagues, and still his heart was hardened. So, you know, all this takes time. It just doesn't happen overnight. And I think that's true. I mean, I think of our country with the slaves and the blacks, and still all the turmoil that's going on. And it seems like you don't hear anything for a while as much, and then all at once it flares up again, like in the last few years here. But there again, it's a time issue, I think. You've got to think God's still in there working, but sometimes it doesn't look like it, or look like he's going as fast as we would like it to be. Put it that way.
Most of the history of the Israelites was spent. We only read in the Bible about those moments where God's action moved the people in a direction towards their liberation or restoration. All of the rest is just, you skid over a couple hundred years sometimes, or several decades.
Mhm.
So I guess I would ask, whose interpretations of reality were they all relinquished? Because maybe there were winners and losers of a particular engagement, and there was maybe celebration on one side and weeping on the other, and it was a terrible thing for some, but were all hearts and minds changed in the same direction, or were there such terrible loss that some didn't were hardened even further? And I don't know, where is God in that? I'm not sure. Hopefully there's mercy for everyone and healing, and eventually we will have some kind of understanding that God is present in all situations, and that there's love available for everyone. But it's hard to say, when VE Day came and the Nazis were vanquished, and were their hearts changed? I mean, we were victorious. Our allies were victorious, but what about the families of the soldiers? I mean, I don't know. It just all seems like tragic loss to me.
The Soviets were victorious.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah, they were our allies. Yeah, that's right. I mean, they went home and massacred a bunch of people and starved a bunch of more people, and so it's right. It's just hard to. I'm puzzling over the question here just a little bit. I mean, I know in my own life what
I think the
challenging my assumptions of order, legitimacy, and control mean. I know what that means. I know what that's about. That's happened in my life.
I think the victory came from World War II. Carrie Tom Boom, or however you say her name, and Eva down at Terre Haute, when they proclaimed to the world that they could forgive these people who had hurt them. This was a victory.
Sure.
And this was the good that came out of it.
That's certainly one of the goods.
A lot of suffering, especially those people who lost family members during all this, and the separation for families as well. There, a lot of, with John Vietnam, I understand the separation of families from family members, and that can be very difficult, as well as losing family members. But at the end, when you come back and you're able to say, I forgive them, I love them, they're God's children, then you have victory.
That's a very good point. But the way he phrases the question is I'm taking a little bit of
it's a hard question.
Yeah.
And
relinquish old interpretations of reality.
And when Pharaoh's weeping there, he's weeping over his dead firstborn, which makes me think, wait. Like, I don't care who you are, like that, my heart's with the parent holding their child. So I agree. It's by no means clear. There are some moments where we feel it's clearer than others. And we could cite historic examples or moments from our own life. But then when we were talking about the Allies in World War II, I was thinking about the bombing of Dresden, how you would feel if you were an old person or a child in that city.
Yeah.
Where German, sure, but
they're civilians. It was civilian targets.
And it becomes very entrenched. Here's I don't know where this exactly fits in the discussion, and we've been here an hour, so we need to. We could talk about this much longer, but my kids were playing in the backyard with the neighbors, and the bad guys that they were like running from were the Germans.
Hmm.
In 2021, my kid, I'm like, where did you hear this? And they were like, so at some point to the question of forgiveness, when in 2021, kids who don't even know what they're saying, they don't know World War II, they don't know Nazis, they are using, and we're mostly German, it says ancestry.com, even though my last name is Welsh.
Your whole name is Welsh.
Yeah.
Perhaps-
that?
Perhaps they could let Darth Vader be their enemy or something.
Yeah, pick
Yeah.
something, a caricature of, but
Baron
Darth
von
Vader.
Harkonnen.
Yeah, listen,
And pull out the sable and go after
I
it.
have loved Dune. Anyway, sorry.
Sorry.
I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled with everything about that. Anyway, yeah. If there could be a caricature of evil, then maybe then. But no, sorry. I'll end with this. 1 in 5 persons in Wales have the last name Jones. Have a wonderful week. And and for next week, we're not meeting next week, but for the following week, same pattern. Read the next chapter and read the suggested scripture readings for that chapter and come ready to discuss. God bless you all. Take care.
You too. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for giving us the week off.
Yeah.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Good Thanksgiving.
Same to you.